fascinated about you and your story, because I want to know more about your time as a youth, learning from these ancient wisdom women, and just kind of bring me up until now, if you could, in the short version.
But you wanted to start with how was the last year for me, or
Yeah, let's start there. Let's start with how was the last year for you, and what has like your whole lead. I feel like some of us have been preparing for this moment our whole lives, like how to handle it, and you know.
Yeah.
Let's go right for the jugular.
Yes, yes. Well, no, it's good because I think, when you say some of us feel like we've been preparing our whole life for this moment, right? That's true for some people. And then, like you said, some people don't have the luxury to even take care of the basics.
Right.
I know so many people are struggling so tremendously between, like you said, children, or keeping the lights on, or keeping their relationship going it's fault lines. I always call it fault lines. I did it before the pandemic, right? It's like when you get into a situation where the going gets tough, all your previous creases and fault lines, so to speak, erupt, right? And then that means some people had real relational reckonings, positively and negatively. I know about as many people who have separated or solidified their separations as I've know people who've really come together in beautiful ways, or often even reconciled, right? So there's that, so as you were saying, some of us had the luxury of doing some inner work. Some of us are just keeping their nose above the waterline, barely, if at all. And I have a few friends who have very small children who never were socialized, right? Because they kind of were just about to be walking and crawling and connecting with other kids as the pandemic started, and haven't since, right? Which is, I think, quite an interesting thing to look at developmentally speaking. So that all said, for me, the pandemic was an interesting situation because I was actually in Europe when it became clear that things were going to, get a bit interesting for a while. And of course, I thought, oh, well, by June, I'll be back. By May, I'll be back in Australia. By June, I'll be back in Amsterdam. And of course, none of that happened. And so I had to make the rather difficult decision to cancel a sold out and really, really big and event that I really wanted to do, all brand new stuff in London. And I had found this amazing space, and it was just something I really, really wanted to do. And it was kind of before it really kicked off. It was the weekend before that, March 15th.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah, clear. Yeah.
And so there was a lot of opposition of people going, you're overreacting, and what's the problem? And so my pandemic started with a huge upheaval, so to speak. And then I flew home. I scheduled a flight home earlier than I should have. And then had a funny feeling the day after I scheduled it, and rescheduled to another day earlier, which was the luckiest thing ever, because I landed in LA as they announced the travel ban. And so I made it through immigration fairly unscathed, meaning the lines were normal length lines.
Right.
It was very crazy and freaky, and some people were wearing masks and some people were not. And so in an odd way, for me, it was kind of a bit more of what happened when the fire happened, right? Yeah. Where I was in Europe, and then catastrophe hit, and then I had to kind of fly home under duress and then land and deal with stuff. And so I had rehearsed for this pretty much 3 years earlier. So I had a basic sense in my body about what needed to happen. how to deal with things, how to work on all the different aspects that it required, because of course I had to self-quarantine the moment I landed, which meant all my support system as far as food, cleaning, animals all fell away at the same time as I was trying to figure out what to do professionally. And, so that all said, lengthy story. I'm very happy to report that to me, the pandemic on one end was creatively incredibly fruitful.
Yeah.
And that my natural and trained resilience came in really, really handy. And I was able to pivot and pivot very fruitfully and creatively. But I think personally, it's been very difficult because through a series of circumstances that I don't need to go into, I actually have been on my own, so completely by myself, no one intimately related to me or even friends or business partners in the same place as me. So
Yeah.
I haven't been touched in over a year at
Oh,
all.
sister.
Yeah.
That has been, sorry to interrupt, but I just like, I just needed a breath with that because I don't think people understand. I did a whole post about it, about that necessity. Yeah, it's, we take it for granted, I think.
Yes. Well, I think there's lots of things we take for granted. And like you were saying, as we started with leveling up or something like that, I think for me personally, for someone who is very, I'm very, very specific who I touch, or, I'm not a very touchy-feely person with people I don't know, but with people I know and with a select few, I'm very, and then of course, I have a whole set of preferences as far as my personal sexual intimacy and things, and all of that went, right?
Yeah.
All of that went. And so I've kind of taken that as a way of looking at, well, what actually happens when that happens? And there was a secondary consideration that I think is worth mentioning. Like you said, right? It's such a big deal. We're so used to being touched. Even if it's just a massage or chiropractic adjustments or things like that, all of which dropped off to begin with. Eventually, my chiropractor and a few other people and I formed a bubble, so to speak. So, and the windows were open and all precautions were taken, but that was months later. And then she moved out of town. But for me personally, it was a bit of an, I don't know how to say this without it sounding really horrible, but I got a sense of what it must be like when you get old.
Yeah.
I got a really strong sense of what it would be like if you no longer have a partner because they died or whatever, right? And you are isolated, and you have the fruits of your life around you if you're lucky, right? But you might not have. I don't have children, right? So and your support isn't there, and your friends aren't accessible. Which in my case, all my partner's friends, intimate relationship, all of that were stuck in other countries. So the question there was, wow, is this what it's going to be like when I'm old, whatever old means at that point? And is that the experience that a lot of people have, where there is more isolation, less connection, less touch, less available stimulation and stuff like that? And that gave me some great pause as to how it must be for people, and to also look at how I in my work can extend something there. Also experimenting with how that would be for myself. What would be the meaning of my life if it's not the things that I take for granted? Right? Is there meaning? What would that mean? How would I have to maintain mental health, physical health, stimulation? What would I not do? So it's been a very fruitful time, but not entirely pleasant.
That's what I said. It's not always easy, but on the other side, like I said, there's clarity. For me, there's been a lot of freedom, strength in knowing what I want. You touched on so many things there that are on my list of things. And I usually don't go down a list, but you did touch on something about your intuition and coming back. And that particular story that you tell in the book, by the way, it's like dog-eared and highlighted. And this is the second one. I know I gave it to somebody, my first one, and I can't remember who. And I'm like, well, it's theirs. I'm buying another one. Well worth it. So you got 2 out of me.
Nice.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of people bought the book and then bought the audio book because I got to read my own book, which is not
good,
the case.
good.
And
I'm writing a memoir now, and a lot of people are. I never even had the thought of someone else reading it, so I'm glad you read your own, especially with your voice, and you're a teacher, you know, so that comes through that kind of cadence and wisdom. But you talk about in the book the story of your friend in the desert. And that experience probably prepared you for any of this. Like, I can't even imagine that. And the intuition, right? And being in touch. I really want to kind of hone in on the importance of that as women. And I feel like we're losing touch. We're allowing all these outside sources, whether it be media or social media or whatever, and it's overriding our natural operating system.
yes. Well, you can go pretty far out with this, which is definitely one of my hobby horses, so to speak. Not only hobby, because I, of course, also do this for a living, but one of the things that I'm very, very big on is to understand that when we talk about embodiment, right, which is a big term, of course, right, and everybody's now in embodiment, and it's this thing. Well, what does that actually mean when you really, really boil it down to? What it really means is that your body always sends signals, right? Always. Because long before we even had a properly functioning brain, so to speak, right, we had a body that kept us alive and evolving and procreating and eating and, you know, all of that. So we have very, very in-depth, strong bodily wisdom. And that bodily wisdom constantly sends messages. So that's embodiment, is essentially that you're able to hear the messages of your body. Right? It's as simple as that. The more external noise there is, and I'll talk about there's 3 aspects of what keeps us from hearing the messages, right? The more external noise there is, the less you hear the messages of your body. And so intuition is specifically the intuition we're talking about, which is kind of a felt gut sense, right? Some people talk about third eye intuition, right? That's a whole thing, particularly in certain yoga communities. That's more like a fine realm up there, not so connected with your body. And you see often people who are very into their third eye point and stuff like that. They are very fine realm, somewhat disembodied often, or very light in their energy, right? And there's people who, when they meditate or do certain yoga, they go up and out, and it's all about up here,
and not grounded, not bringing that
not
down
grounded.
into.
But that's, you know, that's a choice. It's a lifestyle choice, so to speak.
Yes, correct.
You just can't conflate one with the other, right?
Right.
So, but then there's people who go in and down, and when their body comes online, then it's a different kind of intuition. It's the intuition that makes you know that your child is in danger.
Yeah.
Or the intuition that makes you know that your partner is up to no good. or you know, or a connection with an animal, or a connection, in my case, with my then friend and teaching partner, right? So that's part and parcel with embodiment and intuition being in the same realm, right? So there are 3, well, there's more, but there's 3 I point out mostly when I'm teaching, because it's good to know these things, right? So there's 3 barriers to being properly embodied, and with that having proper intuition. And we can talk about intuition specifically, but one is stress and anxiety. So the more stress, external as well as internal, you have, and with that, of course, anxiety builds, because anxiety is essentially a displaced or wrongly placed fight or flight response.
Right.
There is no bear chasing us, but
Right.
we feel like a bear is chasing us.
It's just traffic in the 405.
Just traffic in the 405, which is like a bear.
Yeah.
If you're not living in LA, you will not understand this. But traffic on the 405 is an animal all by itself,
Exactly.
right? So that particular noise, internally as well as externally, massively suppresses our ability to listen, right? It's so much noise that you can't hear the soft voice of your body. And only when the body gets very, very loud, either in an injury, a panic attack, or an illness or things like that, then we go, oh, when it's that extreme often. And of course, people who have high levels of noise need very extreme embodiment practices in their estimation, because it takes so much. So they have to do some crazy power yoga thing where the body screams so loud, right, that they hear something. But of course, with the loud screaming, with the extreme, this is the same with a very strong vibrator, for instance, right? Where you need like the jackhammer of vibrators, because
I love
there's so much happening that you don't have subtlety,
that.
right?
Yeah, sensitivity.
And so that's one aspect, right? Then the second one is actual overwhelm or overstimulation, which social media, actual noise. I was in Santa Monica the other day, for the first time in the entire pandemic. I left the house. I had to go and do a shoot, and I had to go to Santa Monica, and the hotel they put me in was right between 2 hospitals.
Oy.
And it was, I hadn't heard a siren in over a year.
Yeah.
It was just like, oh, how do people sleep? How do people live? But I lived in West Hollywood for 15 years and I slept fine, right?
You get used, it's your nervous system. I think I lived in New York City. So,
yeah.
I mean, Midtown. And you realize it's like most people are under a level of low grade anxiety today.
All
Constantly.
the time.
And they don't realize it because they just think that's how it is.
Yeah, you habituate and you kind of shut off and you get numb. But with that, you get numb to all messages of the body, including intuition. And then the third big barrier to embodiment is trauma, either fresh or previous. And when I'm saying trauma, I'm talking injury. So injury physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, I don't know, religiously,
you got it.
any form of injury, right? From very mild to severe, that causes a shutting down or regulating down or shutting off, or having to leave the messages behind because it's not appropriate to feel that much, and all of that. So those are kind of the 3 things, and these 3 things are also barriers to intuition.
We'll talk about that real quick, going back to that leaving, because I think people don't really understand what trauma, and we can, I think we can bring this into the past year, that this has been a trauma for people, for almost everybody.
Oh, for everybody.
And what happens, we talk about embodiment, but to me, the opposite of that is disassociation. Would that be a proper kind of opposite antonym? We just kind of say, I can't, it's survival mode, right?
Right.
So when you're talking about
dissociation can be from very, very mild, you're just a little bit altered, to all the way psychotic, which would be complete break with reality, right? That's a long way to go.
Yeah.
But in that, you could definitely say that the opposite of embodiment, meaning is the pulling away from the messages of the body. As long as you have a body, the body sends messages, right?
Right.
You're not leaving your body permanently, because then you'd be dead. You're just leaving the faculty of even knowing what your body says or wants or does. And of course, in a trauma situation, that is, I don't know how I would say that, that's hardwired as the appropriate thing to do.
Right.
Meaning, in fight or flight, your personal comfort and what you want or need can kill you in proper fight or flight. Right?
Right.
The whole idea in fight or flight is that you don't feel yourself, so you can perform the superhuman feat of lifting the car off your baby, or
Right.
kicking somebody harder than you've ever kicked somebody and running away or whatever, right? So the very essence of fight or flight, and this is what people don't understand often, is that that's actually a healthy,
Right.
perfectly engineered situation that we forget is such, because we want to, you know, always be perfectly regulated. You're not supposed to be perfectly regulated when you
Right.
have to survive, but
Right.
driving on the 4 or 5 is,
It's
well, I was going to say it's not a matter of
depends.
survival. However, it is, right?
Can be. Can be.
It can be. So, you know, but having an argument with a friend is not, right?
Right.
So yes, dissociation is the function of not being able to connect with the messages of the body, and that can have stress. It can be a stress response. Can also be, which is something that most people don't consider. It can also be uh, an inability to be with stronger emotions.
Right.
So it might not be traumatic. It might just be that your body isn't used to having strong sensations. And by the way, this is also very important, because sometimes when people say they want a lot more pleasure than they have, the issue isn't that they can't have more pleasure. The issue is that they can't sustain that level
Yeah.
of pleasure, and they
Yeah.
pop out of their body
Huh.
exactly as if it was a negative thing, because it's just too much pressure down a garden hose, so to speak.
Still stimulation, just on not what we would assume, not fearful, but almost just overwhelm, right? The
It's
overwhelm.
just too much. Too
Yeah.
much pleasure will shut you off exactly as too much pain.
Yeah.
And that's building capacity within your system, allows you to have more of the negative, but it, you know, meaning you stay in your body even if it's negative. Uh, but you can also stay in your body when it's extremely pleasurable. And so coming back to the thing in the book, just to wrap this up,
Yeah.
when I realized that my friend was missing, my friend and teaching partner, the way I found out he was missing was he didn't show up for a workshop.
Yeah.
And people were coming in the door, and you know, chairs are being set up, and I'm having to juggle, where is he? And I knew something horrible must have happened, because there was no way that if he could even drag himself anywhere, he would not let me know. Right.
Yeah.
So I knew it was really bad. I just didn't know, was it bad as in he was injured and couldn't move, or he was dead. Right. So I, you know, and you don't want to believe the worst, of course. But
Yeah.
I had to teach a class, right, in the midst of trying to figure out what were next steps. So I couldn't, I'm laughing because, well, truth be told, I teach, there'd be a break, I'd go in the green room, throw up in a bucket, try and make some phone calls, go back out and teach, right? So it was like that level of what just had happened. But I didn't know, was I overreacting? Was it as bad as I thought it was? If it was as bad as I thought it was, I certainly shouldn't be acting out of a place of that much adrenaline in my system, and you know, all of that. So when it came time to actually use my intuition, I had to use every ounce of every practice I've ever known or had to settle my system so I could actually feel anything.
Listen, yeah, what you just explained to me is the essence, and I know you don't use this word a lot because it's taken on new meaning, but I know that you are classically trained in Tantra. And for me, part of what Tantra has done for me is built my capacity to hold energy on either side of the spectrum, on, you know, and like you just mentioned, how many people would have just totally said workshops canceled. You know, you were able to hold a container of big energy and still deal.
Yeah.
And I think, I'm hoping somewhat of that's what the pandemic did, is at least that's what it did for me. Again, I had the space and the luxury to do that work. It built a bigger container, a stronger container for me to deal with the world and stay stable, because no one's going to give you happiness. You can't rely on who the president is, what's happening outside of you. And if you could build those resources. So why don't we talk about some of those resources that you did? I'd love to hear a little bit more about your personal story about how did you get to that point where you were able to handle that situation?
Yeah. And I also want to say to what you said with the pandemic, I think this is the lesson in it, right? If you have the luxury, of course. Even if you don't have the luxury, it can be a side effect, is
Right.
that you realize that there is no one to rely on. And this is, by the way, true for the touch. And that's what I found very profound in the unpleasantness of not being in relationship the way I'm used to being in relationship. I had to really develop a whole lot of muscle of not melting down around that, right?
Yeah.
And being able to supply myself or source myself completely free of external, input there. And that's super important, right? I think it makes you sovereign in a different way.
That's been my favorite word, is sovereign. And I think people are misinterpreting it as selfishness and, you know, oh, the United States, arrogance, sovereign. I go, no, internal sovereignty, to not have to rely on anybody. And then when you don't have to, the joy of wanting to and coming together, it builds relationships not out of need, or what I think would be classically termed in psychology codependency, but out of true desire and love.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, it's just a whole new way of being in the world, I feel.
Yeah, I do definitely agree. And, pandemic notwithstanding, that's a good lesson, right? To, and that is, by the way, why people go in caves and on special retreats and stuff like that, because those are the lessons you learn when you interrupt your habitual pattern.
Yeah.
Right. So, but anyway, you were asking me a different question, which was, how did I get there? Well,
Yeah.
I think it's a combination of factors, but certainly I had some experiences very, very early on of both modeling of real resilience in my parents. So I was very lucky in the sense that I have incredible parents. They're still alive and, just incredible human beings. And both of my parents had some very specific traumatic situations within their health. My mother lost an eye when she was 10. In essentially, it's a long story, but there was a bully in school who lived above them in where she lived, and it was her birthday, and her 10th birthday, I believe, 10th or 11th birthday, and he chased her home, threatening her, and she ran in, and it was one of those glass doors, those frosted glass doors.
Yeah.
This is the 50s, right?
Jesus.
Yeah, and she looked through the frosted glass, and he went through the glass with his hand, shattered the glass. The glass hit my mother's eye. and my mother was blinded on that eye under really horrific circumstances, and it couldn't be repaired, and she's still blind on the one eye. She didn't lose the eye, but it's completely cloudy. And what, so I'm saying this to say my mother had to deal with that, and then of course had some other very bad injury before she was even of age. And so I think she had an incredible amount of resource and resilience to begin with. And then my father had a near fatal accident when I was 6 and was in a hospital for over 6 months, with my sister being a baby. And my parents were in the middle of building a house. My father was paralyzed. And so I grew up watching my father teaching himself how to walk again, which was, to a 6-year-old, not that big of a deal. But looking back at it, to see what that took, and to see the determination and the memory of us going to a hiking path on a Sunday morning, and my dad pulling himself out of the car with crutches, and then pulling himself up a steep Austrian mountain on crutches, and feeling his frustration of it, but also seeing his resilience, really informed a part of me. And I can say that now, that's hindsight, of course.
Yeah. And I think this is why I love you so much, is there's a grit to you. And I think it's why I resonate with some people that are like, that have had real, like, that's trauma to the 9th degree, and either witnessed it or been a part of it. And you look at the world now and you're like, you're worried about what someone's calling you. Like,
it's a different thing, and it's certainly a different thing, because there's whole theories around the fact that the people who went through World War II and the famines and this, they're all dying out, so to speak, right? And so the knowledge of real suffering and real perseverance and real resilience is being replaced by a kind of a fake facsimile of upset. And that's not to say that there isn't still horrible things happening.
Right.
Inequities and inequalities and all of that. But I think it's a very different story when you have crawled out of a bomb shelter, and you see that what used to be your house is just flat rubble, than when you feel that somebody's done you wrong in some, I don't know, your green juice wasn't right or something. I mean, I'm being a bit silly here, but
it's that level of that example is the degree to which people have become sensitive, and not sensitive in the way we were talking before, as to their own inner feelings, is like someone else's aggression against them, or needing safe spaces, and I feel like it's dividing us more. But anyways,
yeah, that's a whole conversation that probably is a different conversation. But it definitely is to be said that when we are not faced with the right kind of adversity, we have to somewhat create something to push against, so our system stays resilient, right? So there's reasons why we do certain things, and they can get very aberrated when it's all about us and no longer about service or relationship or connection. And of course, we're living in a time where it's all about us in a very odd way, But I think developing resilience and grit is important, because inevitably in everyone's life, no one's exempt from that. In whatever situation, that can go from you having lost your job and lost your house and suddenly living in a car, right, to not having the right green juice, right? Like, I mean, there's, I mean, that's a silly example, but, living in relative wellness, but also being touch deprived or whatever. There's a vast span of bucking up and meeting the challenges with some grit and determination, instead of hoping that somebody else will fix it for you, right? or blaming someone else.
Yeah.
The thing that we must acknowledge, right, is that there's huge suffering people have on a daily basis that we are not even fully aware of, because we're not privy to them. You know, we live on the West Coast, things are pretty open and tolerant, and you know, it's a different situation than when you, let's say, live in the Appalachian region of the US, where you are in any kind of, you know, where people don't have enough food to feed their kids on a regular basis. And when the school stopped, you know, providing school lunches, the kids would go hungry. I mean, to me, that's insanity to think that this is a country that is, of course, not where I grew up, right? That is so rich, where people don't have what it takes to feed their little kids a lunch, right? So I think there's, and also a country, of course, where there is huge racial divide in all ways, that to a European was a real, I had to really learn some things, because I had no idea. I had no idea. Because when you're European, you know, you don't know about American history growing up, of course, or see the inner workings. So I think there is some real hardship and some real you know, some real rough stuff that we are not aware of where we sit, you know, absolutely. And that we have become more aware in this time of the pandemic. And, you know, and that's not even to talk about people who walk from Honduras to the border because that's preferable to their situations there, right? And I mean, it is so mind-bogglingly brutal out there in the world, right? I mean, so brutal out there in the world when you start honing in on one thing at a time. And, you know, I'm not even talking about, you know, animal rights, or I mean, however you slice it, it's brutal out there. It's just that we, I think, as humans, have an ability, and there's a reason for that, right? In survival, we have an ability to tune out anything that's not within our little, you know, in our little surrounds, so we can function, so we are not constantly overwhelmed and traumatized, and unable to perform our duties in the world, right?
Yeah. And I don't know, I got to the point where I'm aware of all that's happening. But if I allowed myself, like you said, to try to figure out how to solve it, I can only change my circumstances. I can only change my response to those things. And hopefully when I'm put in a position to help and given the ability, then I will do that, and given the opportunity.
I think that's the real crux when we come back to intuition and the body. Your best service to the world is that you are able to contribute versus take.
Yeah.
Right. So that's to me, when we boil it down, whatever special snowflake complaints people have, you know what I mean with special snowflake complaints, right? Oh, my green shoes, all the way to the most horrific set of circumstances, right? Within that entire spectrum, you can look at it. Are you contributing or are you taking? Are you sucking the air out of life itself, right, for your own personal gain? Or do you have enough wherewithal within yourself and resources that you're not taking, that you're not consuming, that you're not imposing, that you're not, you know, accidentally or willingly rob energy, life force, resources, whatever.
Yeah.
And so how you do that is you are self-sufficient in your body, you have resilience, you have capacity, you get the best education you can have in the realm in which you are.
Yeah.
right? Whatever that is, in and also in within your realm of gifts and expertise,
Yeah.
right? Because you're not useful in an area where you don't even where you have blind spots and where you don't know anything.
Yeah.
So you have two options. You can either get an education in that area, or you can pool all your resources and put it somewhere where you can actually contribute. And how do you do it? Once again, your body is sane and sound. You allow yourself to feel what needs to be felt so you can actually not suck the life out of the conversation or the situation or the circumstance. And you can bring your depth and your experience and your resilience and your grit as a service.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the feminine, and because so much of this book is about the flow, finding flow again in a world that seems to be consumed by go, go, go.
Yeah.
So, and what it means to be a feminist. I was crying last night reading this book because I feel like in order to shore up my resources, like we were saying, I've had to call on a lot of my masculine. I've had to call on a lot of that. And right now I'm like, ugh, I need some help. I need somebody else to take over the masculine so I can flow a little bit.
Yeah. I know. Yeah. Well, the problem with masculine and feminine, of course, in the bigger picture, is that people conflate masculine and feminine with men and women.
Yep.
And then that creates a gender war and also polarizes people in ways that they don't need to be polarized, because then it becomes about sexual orientation or gender identity. None of that is, of course, what we are talking about, right? And that's why I often just call it go and flow, because we all have go and we all have flow.
Right.
And the only time go and flow, or masculine and feminine, go being masculine and flow being feminine, right? But it's an internal state and not men and women, because every man has masculine and feminine, every woman has masculine and feminine, right? But where it becomes really interesting is when we engage in a sexual dynamic, or when we become imbalanced, right? And so what you're talking about is the imbalance aspect, where our feminine, meaning the part of us that needs to play and rest and relax and have colors and textures and flavors and be in nature and be creative and have relationship, all of those aspects of each human being are the more, the flow aspects are the more feminine aspects. And the parts that buck up regardless of what's happening, that have a plan, that get stuff done, that are on time, that track grids and systems and set, things in motion, that part of us has been so overtaxed, both from a cultural viewpoint, also from a pure survival viewpoint, right? Because when you are in a pandemic, your first and foremost resource is your ability to be in go, be structured, to make things happen, to have a plan, to have toilet paper and rice in ample, in ample quantities. People have definitely taken that to a new level, right? So, but that is the go aspect of all of us, and our go aspect has been massively taxed. Now, why I wrote a whole book about the feminine and flow is that for both men and women, we have an absence of flow in our life, right? We have an absence of that open, sensual as in all five senses involved, enjoyment, open-ended connection, nature, connection to our own cycles. In women, because and when I'm saying women, I'm talking now first biologically, right? So endocrine system. And then, of course, we can also talk about sexual orientation and identification, but that's a secondary thing. From a endocrine system, if you have periods or used to have periods, you have female hormones in the body, you have cycles happening, all of that, because even if you're menopausal, you still have cycles, all of those kind of things. When you have that kind of a system, your system's health relies on flow. And if you happen to be sexually oriented towards wanting to also be in the flow sexually versus in the go sexually, then it's particularly important that your body is able to be in the flow. So some people like to be the one leading a sexual occasion predominantly. We all like a little bit of variety.
Flipping the
Yes,
roles.
flip-flop, right? That's why every human should develop all capacities.
Right.
But we typically have a preference. We like to be taken on the ride, or we like to be the ones taking somebody on that ride. We like to be the one who leans back and kind of surrenders. Exactly, right? And gets mindless.
Sounds so nice.
I know,
right
doesn't it? Yes, And then some people don't like that. They like to be the one being in control, guiding the thing and whatever. By the way, we do need to end on time because I have a video call.
Okay.
In 7 minutes.
Okay.
That's a whole different story. But so I want to just finish that by saying, when you're sexually wanting to be the one being taken, your body needs to be able to actually sustain that. And because we're human beings and are governed by our habits, and whatever we do the most builds the strongest pathways, if you do 10, 12 hours of go, and then you want to flip into flow, you're going to have a really hard time. You won't have muscle for flow. And then you're going to attract people who would rather you stay and go, which then makes you not want to be with them because they're too flowy for you. And then if you happen to be a heterosexual woman, that means you're with a noodly, flowy, glowy man who can't get his shit together, right? If you're not heterosexual, that means you might be wanting to surrender into the flow, but you're now with a partner who also wants to surrender into the flow, and it's really boring and you no longer want to have sex. And there's all these horrible dynamics when your flow isn't fully I don't know,
flowing,
developed, polished, played with. And so in women, it has also a health function to it, of course, right? A reproductive health function. It has to do with how our hormones flow to the body. And so that's why I wrote a book specifically for women and, who have to deal with both the endocrine as well as the sexual aspect. And then, of course, there's also an identification aspect, which also falls into that category of being able to surrender and let go and go on the ride. And most of us want that, but don't have the tools for it or the muscle for it.
Well, what would you say to the people? I mean, I'm hearing a lot now is that, those are just traditional. You're in a traditional model, like where the feminine is one thing and the masculine, and how I think we understand that we're talking about energies here, right? Like you said, it's not male, female, but people have a hard time understanding, like there's a biological thing going on as a woman that carries certain energies. Yes. Like that.
Yes, but that's why I don't call it masculine and feminine, right? We just go with the nervous system has that, right? There's sympathetic and parasympathetic.
Right.
There's the endocrine system, which has certain hormonal balances within both men and women, right? Where you either more on the serotonin or on the dopamine end of things. Dr. Helen Fisher does a lot of amazing work on that, and this is true for men and women. And you have estrogen, testosterone traits that are in the brain that don't even have to do with gender, by the way, right? So if you're not familiar with her work, she's one of my heroes.
I'll put her
Dr.
in the
Helen
notes for
Fisher,
sure,
yeah.
and I'll look into it.
You know, so there's endocrine balances that have nothing to do with how you identify or what you want to do
Right.
in your life. And I think the really important piece has nothing to do with being traditional. It has to do with being a full human being and being able to be who you want to be. If you want to sexually surrender, which a lot of people do, men and women alike, you need to have the muscle to sexually surrender. If you're going all day and kicking ass and taking names later, you don't have the muscle to sexually surrender, right?
Yeah.
For instance. So this has nothing to do with becoming a 50s housewife. I certainly am not a 50s housewife under any circumstances. But I do sexually and as well in my spare time for myself be able to enter the realms of ritual, of myth, of play, of flow, of surrender, of sexual letting go, of getting out of my head. And then in my life, I want to be able to kick ass with the best of them and be successful and do the things I want to do. And for both of those things to be fully activated, I need to be able to switch back and forth. And the only reason we talk about women who want to engage in that kind of play, engaging in a certain set of practices, is because in our regular life, we're so much in go, all of us.
Yeah.
So if we would be living in a commune in the woods, flowing all day, with our animals and partners and lovers and herbs and music, right?
Sounds lovely.
Sounds amazing, right? And then we have to go work. We probably would have to, I would have to write an entire book on how to get into go.
Right. Right.
Sustainably get into go.
Right. Right.
And but we do go all day, and then we want to flow, and then we don't know how, and then that causes relational issues, and so on and so on.
Yeah, and I know you have to go, but that's your work, right? That's what this work is about.
That is what this is all about.
And we didn't even get to the tips. They're all in the book, about the dancing, what you feel, moving how you feel. I did that before our conversation today because I realized how much I'm missing.
Do we need to pick it up at some other point? Do you need some more?
You know, I'll start with this, and I would love to have you back because there's so much